The room was already heavy with tension, every eye trained on the bench where power sat robed in black. Reporters filled the gallery, their pens hovering, cameras rolling, waiting to capture history. And then, in the middle of a carefully crafted argument, it happened. A sound that sliced through the seriousness of the chamber. A laugh, sharp, dismissive, cutting. It came from Justice Brett Kavanaugh. It wasn't the kind of laugh that eases a room. It was the kind that belittles, that mocks, that signals you don't belong here. And for a moment, it threatened to derail the entire proceeding. Heads turned. Pens scratched furiously across notepads. The arrogance in that laugh wasn't subtle, it was deliberate, and everyone knew it. But standing at the center of it all was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She didn't flinch. She didn't shuffle her papers. She didn't avert her gaze. Instead, she fixed her eyes on the justice, her expression calm but unyielding, the kind of stillness that carries more weight than 1,000 shouted words. In that stillness was defiance, was dignity, was the quiet certainty of someone who knew she had earned her place in that room. In a single moment, the cameras would later replay, the laughter of one justice nearly derailed the room, until Jasmine Crockett responded in a way no one expected. You could feel the silence swell as the echo of his chuckle faded. Even the audience, used to political theatrics, sensed they were watching something different, something dangerous. Because when power laughs at you in public, it is meant to humiliate, to shrink you down. And yet, Crockett didn't shrink. She grew taller in that silence, commanding it, reshaping it into her weapon. The reporters' lenses zoomed closer, searching for a tremor, a break in her composure. They didn't find one. What they caught instead was the steadiness of her breathing, the steel in her eyes, the slight tightening of her jaw. A portrait of resilience framed against arrogance. The laugh was meant to diminish her, but instead, it set the stage for a reversal no one in that courtroom could have anticipated. Because what Jasmine Crockett said next would not just answer that laugh, it would freeze the entire court in silence. To understand why that single laugh mattered, you have to step back and see the broader stage on which it landed. This wasn't just an exchange between a justice of the Supreme Court and a first-term congresswoman. It was a collision of power and identity, a clash between centuries of entrenched privilege and the new, unapologetic voices that refused to be silenced. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk into that courtroom with the insulation of establishment power. She walked in carrying the weight of representation, young, black, female, unapologetically outspoken. In her presence alone was a challenge to the order that had long defined American institutions: who gets to speak, who gets to be heard, who gets to belong. That's why the laugh stung so deeply. It wasn't simply about disagreeing with her argument. It was a reminder of the old rules, the ones that said people like her should know their place. But America is different now. The faces sitting at tables of power no longer look the same, sound the same, or accept the same boundaries. Crockett embodied that shift, and in doing so, she also embodied the resistance that always rises up to push back against it. The stakes couldn't have been higher. In a moment when democracy itself feels fragile, when questions of representation and fairness sit at the center of national debate, every interaction between authority and challenger becomes symbolic. And here, in one of the most revered rooms in America, the symbol was raw and undeniable: arrogance laughing down at dignity. Millions of people watching from living rooms across the country didn't just see a courtroom exchange. They saw themselves. They saw every moment they'd been dismissed in a classroom, spoken over in a meeting, laughed at when they dared to demand respect. They felt the sting of that sound because they had lived it in their own lives. And so the question wasn't just whether Jasmine Crockett would answer back. It was whether she would answer for all of them. That is what made the air so charged. You could almost feel the weight of history pressing on the moment, whispering, "Do not let this pass. Do not let this stand unchallenged." And Jasmine Crockett, standing steady in that silence, seemed to understand exactly what rested on her shoulders. She wasn't just a congresswoman arguing a point of law. She was a mirror of America's fight for dignity in the face of derision, for truth in the face of mockery. That's why every eye in that chamber, and every lens broadcasting to millions, stayed fixed on her. Would she falter? Would she let the laugh define her? Or would she redefine the room with her response? The choice wasn't hers alone. In a sense, it belonged to everyone who believed that democracy only survives when every voice is respected. Crockett was carrying them all, and the silence that followed Kavanaugh's laugh wasn't emptiness. It was anticipation, a nation holding its breath. The courtroom had become a stage, and the stakes had grown larger than the walls could contain. The stakes were larger than one courtroom. The next words would echo across the nation. Brett Kavanaugh has never been a stranger to controversy. His name alone stirs memory of hearings that gripped the nation, hearings not remembered for brilliance of argument or clarity of thought, but for the shadow they cast over the Supreme Court itself. From the moment his nomination was announced, his rise was marked by accusations, by anger, by the unmistakable air of a man convinced that the seat was his by right. His past hearings were not quiet affairs. They were battles, shouted testimonies, tears, denials, and fury. America watched as privilege stood trial before the court of public opinion. And when the dust settled, when the vote was tallied, Kavanaugh still rose to the bench, confirmed not because the doubts were erased, but because power had willed it so. That history mattered. Because in every smirk, every dismissive gesture, every mocking laugh, people saw the same man they had seen during those hearings, defensive, entitled, unwilling to entertain the possibility that anyone could truly challenge him. His laugh in the Crockett exchange was not born in that instant. It was the echo of years of arrogance, of a worldview shaped by insulation from consequences. Kavanaugh represents something larger than himself. He is the embodiment of a class of men who never imagined that their authority could be checked, whose lives have been smoothed by privilege at every turn. His very presence on the bench is proof of that dynamic, a man who weathered storms of accusation and still ascended to one of the most powerful positions in the land. To those who revere tradition, he is a symbol of continuity. But to millions who saw injustice in his confirmation, he is the face of a system that bends over backward to protect its own. That laugh, then, was more than a sound. It was a declaration: this space belongs to me, not to you. You will never truly be equal here. It carried the weight of his past and the entitlement of his position. It was a reminder of how the powerful have long dismissed the voices of women, of people of color, of anyone who dared to step outside the lines drawn for them. And yet, across from him sat Jasmine Crockett. She didn't match arrogance with anger. She didn't rise to meet condescension with chaos. Instead, she met it with stillness. Her composure was the sharpest contrast imaginable to Kavanaugh's smirk. Where he was dismissive, she was deliberate. Where he laughed, she waited. Where he sought to belittle, she allowed silence to magnify his arrogance. It was that contrast that transformed the moment. In the still frame of that courtroom camera, you could see two Americas staring at each other across the divide, one clinging to the old order, laughing at the idea of challenge, the other refusing to bow, insisting on respect, even when it was denied. And this is where Kavanaugh miscalculated. He believed his laugh was the final punctuation, a subtle signal of superiority that would fade into the rhythm of the hearing. What he didn't realize was that he had given Crockett a gift. Because arrogance rarely knows when it has exposed itself, and in that moment of dismissal, Kavanaugh revealed everything. His past, his privilege, his belief in his own untouchable authority. The cameras caught it. The reporters wrote it down. The country heard it. And Jasmine Crockett stood there, absorbing it all, steady and certain, ready to turn it back on him. But Kavanaugh didn't realize the trap he had walked into. Jasmine Crockett's story does not begin in marble halls or wood-paneled chambers. It begins far from the centers of entrenched power, in communities too often overlooked and voices too often ignored. Before her name was spoken in Congress, before television cameras broadcast her face into millions of homes, she was a lawyer, a fighter, a woman standing shoulder to shoulder with people who had nowhere else to turn. Crockett cut her teeth not by chasing prestige, but by defending the vulnerable. She took on cases that others dismissed as unwinnable, cases that demanded long nights and longer odds. She wasn't just defending clients, she was defending dignity, reminding the system that even those written off still deserved fairness. In crowded courtrooms and cramped offices, she built a reputation not for compromise but for courage. Her rise was never easy. For every door opened, two more slammed shut. She was underestimated at nearly every turn. Too young, too bold, too unafraid of speaking uncomfortable truths. And yet, those same qualities became her strength. She carried herself with a kind of stubborn dignity, the kind that refuses to be cowed by bias or silenced by ridicule. It wasn't just the cases she fought. It was the stares, the whispered doubts, the systemic biases woven into every corner of her profession. As a black woman, she faced the double weight of racism and sexism, each attempt to belittle her becoming fuel for her determination. Where others saw barriers, she saw battles, and battles were meant to be fought. The leap from advocate to lawmaker was not born of ambition alone. It was necessity. Crockett knew that representing people case by case could change lives, but representing them in Congress could change the system itself. When she ran for office, she didn't run as a polished insider. She ran as the voice of communities tired of being dismissed. And voters responded. They saw in her a reflection of themselves. The grit, the struggle, the resilience. They gave her a platform, and she carried their stories with her into the halls of Congress. Inside those halls, she never played small. She refused to adopt the practiced caution of those who had long mastered the art of saying nothing. Her words carried fire, her presence carried weight. She demanded accountability in hearings, she challenged hypocrisy in debates, And she did it all while carrying the quiet composure of someone who had weathered worse storms outside the walls of Washington. This is what made the laugh in that courtroom so sharp, so cruel, and so dangerous. Because it was not simply dismissing an argument. It was dismissing the journey of a woman who had fought every inch to stand where she stood. To laugh at her was to laugh at the struggles of the communities she represented, to laugh at the resilience of every person who had ever been told they did not belong. But here is where Jasmine Crockett's power becomes undeniable. She did not respond in anger. She did not allow mockery to shake her. She understood that dignity is its own weapon, that composure can cut deeper than rage. Every hardship, every sacrifice, every insult endured along the way had forged in her a strength that arrogance could never anticipate. She knew what it meant to be doubted. She knew what it meant to fight uphill. And she knew what it meant to win anyway. And so, in that silent stare across the courtroom, it wasn't just Jasmine Crockett standing there. It was every client she had defended, every voter who had placed their hope in her, every ancestor who had carried resilience through centuries of struggle. It was a lineage of dignity, embodied in one woman's unshaken gaze. The laugh was meant to reduce her. Instead, it elevated her. It reminded the world of who she was and why she mattered. Because Crockett's story isn't about privilege, it's about persistence. It isn't about entitlement, it's about endurance. And when Arrogance tried to mock her, it underestimated the power of someone who had built her career on turning dismissal into determination. Every step of her journey had prepared her for this exact moment in front of the nation. The air inside the courtroom was taut, as if every breath carried weight. Cameras hummed quietly, capturing every flicker of expression, every slight shift in body language. On one side sat Justice Kavanaugh, his chin lifted just high enough to register superiority, his lips curling in a smirk that seemed rehearsed. On the other stood Jasmine Crockett, calm, composed, her voice steady as she laid out her argument with measured precision. At first, it was civil. Her tone was clear, deliberate, each word chosen to cut through the layered formality of the setting. She wasn't there to grandstand, she was there to speak truth. But civility has its limits, especially when arrogance sits across the table. Kavanaugh's interruptions began quietly, the way a dripping faucet begins before it becomes unbearable. A chuckle here, a dismissive shake of the head there. Small gestures but designed for one purpose: to belittle. Each time Crockett pressed forward, he countered not with thoughtful engagement, but with dismissive cues. A smirk as if her words were naïve. A raised eyebrow as if her points lacked seriousness. The kind of microaggressions cloaked in formality that say more than words ever could. You don't belong in my arena. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. Her tone remained calm, her eyes unbroken. Where others might have faltered, she steadied herself. The silence between interruptions became her weapon, making every pause more powerful, every word more undeniable. She refused to give his arrogance the victory of rattling her voice. And that composure only seemed to aggravate him further. The interruptions grew sharper, his laugh louder. He leaned back in his chair with the posture of a man certain he held the upper hand, dismissing her arguments with the casual arrogance of privilege. To the casual observer, it might have looked like confidence. To those who knew the weight of the moment, it was clear this was the old guard mocking the new, power dismissing progress, privilege scoffing at persistence. Crockett's strength was not in matching arrogance with outrage. It was in her ability to absorb it, to let it play out for everyone watching. Each smirk only highlighted his entitlement. Each dismissive wave of his hand only underscored her patience. She wasn't debating him alone, she was allowing America to see the contrast for itself. The tension grew thicker with every exchange. Viewers across the nation leaned forward, sensing something bigger than just a legal sparring match. This wasn't just about one hearing or one argument. It was about who gets to be heard in America, who gets to define dignity, who gets to laugh, and who gets to lead. And yet, even as Kavanaugh's gestures escalated, Crockett's resolve only deepened. She adjusted her posture slightly, leaning in just enough to signal that she was not backing away. Her words became more precise, her delivery sharper, her silence between sentences louder than any gavel strike. The courtroom, once filled with quiet murmurs and shifting papers, seemed to still around the confrontation. Kavanaugh's laughter rang out one final time, louder, more brazen than before. It was the kind of laugh meant to end a discussion, to reduce his opponent to irrelevance. But in that moment, Crockett did not look diminished. She looked inevitable. She lifted her gaze directly toward him, her voice unwavering, her presence commanding. The camera zoomed in, catching every fraction of the moment, the arrogance on one face, the resolve on the other. And then, with millions watching, she delivered the line that would flip the room. For a brief instant, time seemed to fracture. Justice Kavanaugh's laugh still echoed faintly, a hollow sound that hung in the chamber like smoke. The smirk lingered on his face, the smirk of a man certain he had reasserted dominance. But across from him, Jasmine Crockett did not bend. She drew in a slow, deliberate breath, as though collecting not only her own strength but the weight of history, of generations silenced and dismissed before her. Then she spoke. Her voice was steady, low at first, almost soft enough to invite dismissal again. But this time, the silence of the room wrapped around her words, amplifying them like the hush before a storm. With all due respect, Justice, she began, her tone firm, laughter doesn't erase facts, it doesn't silence truth. And it certainly doesn't change the Constitution. The smirk faltered, just slightly, almost imperceptibly. But the cameras caught it, and millions watching at home would see it replayed again and again. Crockett let the silence breathe. She didn't rush. She let the weight of her words land before she pressed forward, her eyes locked on him, unwavering. You may think this is a game. You may think mocking the people we represent somehow weakens their claim to justice. But I stand here on behalf of those who have always been laughed at, who have always been dismissed, and who have always found a way to rise above arrogance. A ripple of unease shifted through the chamber. Staffers stopped scribbling notes. Even the reporters lowered their pens. It was no longer just testimony, it was testimony turned into truth-telling. Crockett was no longer speaking only to Kavanaugh, she was speaking to history. And then came the pause. She held it, 3 seconds, 4. In a courtroom where silence had been Kavanaugh's weapon, she reclaimed it, turned it into a drumbeat that built suspense with every passing second. Privilege, she continued, her voice sharp now, cutting through the air like a blade, has a way of mistaking its own comfort for truth. But let me be very clear, the people I represent don't need your permission to demand justice. They don't need your laughter to remind them of their worth. They've endured worse. And still, they are here. The air itself seemed to crackle. Kavanaugh shifted slightly, leaning forward, his once relaxed posture betraying the discomfort creeping into his frame. The laugh, the smirk, the casual dismissal, it was gone. In its place sat a man forced into silence, his own arrogance turning into the very trap he had set. The cameras zoomed closer. The nation saw it, the imbalance flip. The predator of the moment suddenly appeared cornered, his authority weakened not by shouting or anger, but by the clarity of a voice he had tried to undermine. And then, a moment few expected, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, seated only a few feet away, turned her gaze toward Crockett. Her expression carried no exaggeration, no theatrics. It was a quiet, unmistakable look of respect. Her eyes widened, ever so slightly, a subtle nod forming as if to say yes, this is truth. It was validation not from the crowd, not from social media, but from the highest bench in the land. For Crockett, it was the kind of recognition that transcends the courtroom. It was history itself bowing its head in acknowledgement. The silence deepened. Even the faint hum of cameras seemed to fade. Crockett pressed forward, her words landing with surgical precision. You can laugh, Justice. You can dismiss. But you cannot erase the fact that democracy is not your inheritance to hoard. It is a promise to every American. And I will not stand silent while arrogance tries to write the story of who belongs and who does not. There was no anger in her voice, only conviction. And that conviction, delivered without apology, froze the room. Kavanaugh blinked, as though searching for the next move, the next counter. But there was none. His laugh, once his shield, had become his undoing. Every smirk now looked less like confidence and more like desperation. And then came the line. The one that would echo not only through the chamber but across the nation. History doesn't remember the ones who laughed at justice. It remembers the ones who stood for it. The words detonated in the silence. The courtroom felt suspended in time, as though the marble columns themselves had absorbed the weight of the declaration. Reporters looked at one another, recognizing instantly that this was the headline, the soundbite, the moment that would ripple far beyond Washington. Justice Jackson's expression deepened into something more than respect, it was pride. A small, resolute smile crossed her face, visible only to those who caught it at the right angle. For Crockett, it was more than validation, it was the proof that brilliance, when rooted in dignity, could not be denied. Kavanaugh leaned back, his once steadfast posture unraveling. The laughter, the arrogance, the smirk, all of it had been dismantled in front of millions. The courtroom, once his stage, had become his reckoning. For Crockett, it was not victory for victory's sake, it was the embodiment of her journey, her resilience, her refusal to bend in the face of mockery. She had not raised her voice, she had not lashed out, and yet she had reduced arrogance to silence. The chamber remained still for what felt like eternity. No gavel struck. No voice interrupted. It was the kind of silence that only follows truth, the kind that lingers because everyone knows something irreversible has just happened. And then slowly reality began to return. Pens scratched again, though shakily. Murmurs crept through the press benches. The cameras pulled back, capturing the scene not just as a hearing, but as a historic turning point. Kavanaugh's eyes dropped for a moment, the weight of defeat settling in. And across the room, Crockett stood tall, not triumphant, but steady, embodying the dignity she had carried into that chamber. It was a mic drop, not of noise but of silence. A silence that told the nation the game had changed. But the impact didn't stop in that courtroom. The silence in the courtroom had barely settled before the outside world caught fire. Within minutes of Jasmine Crockett's devastating counterattack, clips of the exchange began flooding Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Someone clipped the exact moment Justice Kavanaugh's smirk dissolved into unease and paired it with a slow motion zoom. Another account added dramatic background music, Hans Zimmer drums pounding under Crockett's final line. History doesn't remember the ones who laughed at justice. It remembers the ones who stood for it. It spread like wildfire. Hashtags trended within the hour. Ve Crockett Clapback, Fe Respect Crockett, and the one that stuck most, Fe History Remembers. By nightfall, the video had amassed millions of views across platforms. Comment sections were flooded with fire emojis, clapping hands, and words like iconic, queen, and she ate and left no crumbs. TikTok teens stitched the clip with their own reactions, mouths hanging open as the words landed. Twitter users declared it the moment Arrogance got humbled live on camera. Instagram meme pages turned Kavanaugh's laugh into a looping GF captioned aid. When you think you've won the debate, but then. But it wasn't just the internet's entertainment machine at work, it was validation. For communities long dismissed or silenced, Crockett's response felt personal. Immigrant families shared the clip in WhatsApp groups, writing, "This is why we keep fighting." Black activists called it a generational echo of courtroom battles stretching back decades. For millions, it wasn't just a viral moment. It was proof that dignity could still triumph in the most intimidating of spaces. The political world noticed too. By the next morning, fellow lawmakers were posting in support. Progressive leaders hailed Crockett as a voice of courage in the face of condescension. Civil rights organizations released statements praising her composure. Even moderates, often reluctant to weigh in, admitted that her performance was one of the most powerful moments in a courtroom in recent memory. And celebrities, they poured in. Viola Davis retweeted the clip with one word, respect. Ava DuVernay added, "This is why representation matters." Even musicians jumped into the chorus. Rapper Common wrote, "Sis didn't just speak, she preached." The ripple was undeniable. Crockett's name was everywhere, and it was being said with admiration. Meanwhile, the criticism landed exactly where expected. Conservative commentators tried to downplay the moment, accusing her of grandstanding, insisting Kavanaugh's laugh was harmless. But the more they tried to minimize it, the more the clip circulated. Their dismissals only sharpened the contrast: arrogance versus dignity, mockery versus truth, and the public wasn't buying spin. They had seen the video for themselves. For once, the nation wasn't arguing about whether the clip had impact. It was already undeniable. The debate had shifted to what it meant. To millions of young Americans, Crockett represented something bigger than herself. She became a symbol of resistance against elitism, proof that someone from outside the traditional corridors of power could stand toe-to-toe with one of the most privileged figures in the country and not flinch. Parents pointed their daughters to the clip as an example of what strength looks like. College students dissected it in political science classes. Even late-night comedians used the moment as an opener, roasting Kavanaugh's arrogance and praising Crockett's steel composure. But beneath all the memes and hashtags, there was something deeper. It wasn't just about one clash in a courtroom. It was about the cultural hunger for leaders who didn't cower, who could take the sneer of privilege and turn it into silence. In a nation wrestling with cynicism, the moment pierced through. It reminded people, progressives, immigrants, women of color, and beyond, that truth delivered with dignity could still cut through the noise. That laughter, no matter how dismissive, could be silenced by conviction. By the end of the week, Crockett wasn't just a trending name. She was a narrative, one that captured the tension between arrogance and accountability in America. Articles framed her response as a modern David versus Goliath moment. Editorials praised her as the kind of leader America desperately needs. And ordinary citizens, those who often feel invisible in the halls of power, saw themselves reflected in her stance. The courtroom had been just the beginning. The ripple effect had transformed into waves crashing across the culture, waves that carried her story from Washington into living rooms, dorm rooms, and barbershops nationwide. And yet, as loud as the noise became, it was clear that something even more profound lingered under the surface. Because beyond the hashtags, beyond the viral edits and the celebrity endorsements, a deeper truth was beginning to take root. The moment wasn't just about what Jasmine Crockett had said, it was about what she had proven. But beyond the noise of social media, something deeper remained. When the echo of Justice Kavanaugh's laugh first rippled through the chamber, it carried with it centuries of dismissiveness, centuries of voices mocked, ignored, or belittled when they dared to demand justice. But Jasmine Crockett's response transformed that insult into something else entirely: proof that arrogance cannot silence truth. Her words that day were not just a rebuttal to one justice's smirk. They were a declaration, a reclaiming of space that had too often been denied to women of color, to immigrants, to working families whose dignity has long been treated as expendable. In Crockett's calm defiance, America witnessed a universal lesson: arrogance is loud, but dignity is louder. The brilliance of her counterattack wasn't just in its sharpness. It was in its restraint. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't play to the theatrics. She simply stood tall and spoke with the unshakable conviction that justice is stronger than mockery. And in that silence afterward, when the courtroom froze, the world saw the truth: brilliance is the answer to belittlement, courage is the answer to contempt. This was more than a momentary clash. It was a mirror for America. On one side sat privilege, smirking, laughing, dismissing. On the other stood resilience, measured, composed, undeterred. The outcome wasn't decided by power of position but by power of character. And in that room character won. Crockett reframed the insult not as humiliation but as vindication. Because if arrogance feels the need to laugh, it means it is already afraid. Afraid of being exposed. Afraid of being outshined by truth. Afraid of the very dignity it seeks to diminish. That laugh, once meant to belittle, became the symbol of its own weakness. And that is the lesson America carried forward. Dignity is not weakness. It is power. Brilliance is not arrogance, it is clarity. Mockery fades, truth endures. This is why her moment resonated so deeply across the nation. It wasn't just about one courtroom, one exchange, one justice versus one congresswoman. It was about the story of America itself, the ongoing struggle between arrogance and equality, between exclusion and belonging. And on that day, in that silence, the side of dignity claimed victory. Because America's strength has never come from those who laugh at others. It has never come from belittling or dismissing. Its strength has always come from those who refuse to be silenced, who transform insult into inspiration, who remind us that justice is not a privilege, it is a promise. Crockett's presence in that chamber was itself a testament to that promise fulfilled: a young black woman, daughter of a community too often left behind, standing toe to toe with one of the most powerful figures in the country and refusing to flinch. That is America at its best. That is democracy alive. And so, when people replayed that clip again and again, not just to laugh at Kavanaugh's faltering smirk, but to feel the pride in Crockett's steadiness, they weren't just watching politics. They were watching possibility. They were watching the living proof that arrogance can be defeated not with anger, but with poise. Not with noise, but with clarity. In the end, it wasn't the justice's laugh that history recorded. It was Crockett's words. It wasn't his smirk that lingered in memory. It was her composure. And it wasn't arrogance that carried the day. It was truth. That courtroom froze because everyone recognized a deeper law than any written on paper: justice speaks louder than arrogance. Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson's quiet nod of respect was more than a gesture. It was history acknowledging brilliance, dignity affirming dignity. In that courtroom, before the cameras, millions witnessed the exact moment when arrogance was silenced. Not by anger, not by theatrics, but by the calm conviction of Jasmine Crockett. The title of this story wasn't crafted by spin or headlines, it was written in real time. Judge Ketanji Brown respects Jasmine Crockett's brilliance, and her reaction left the court frozen. This was more than politics. It was a reminder of what's possible when courage refuses to bow to mockery, when truth refuses to be overshadowed by privilege. Crockett didn't just defend herself, she defended every American who has ever been dismissed, diminished, or told they don't belong. And in that silence, as the courtroom froze, a nation was reminded justice speaks louder than arrogance. If you believe dignity will always defeat arrogance, share this moment. Let it ripple beyond this video, beyond this channel, into the conversations our country desperately needs. If you want to keep truth alive in America's toughest battles, subscribe. Be part of this movement of voices that refuse to be drowned out. And finally, comment below. Tell us, what did you feel when the court froze? Did you see yourself in that moment? Did you feel the pride of dignity outshining power? Your voice matters here, because this isn't just one story, it's all of ours. Truth has a way of cutting through even the loudest laughter. And today, it cut sharp and clear.